Jefferson County, Mississippi, June 1871. When the Federal Survey team arrived to chart the new levee line along Mason Creek, they expected only mud, mosquitoes, and half-rotted fence posts. What they uncovered instead stopped every man in his tracks. Beneath a collapsed patch of earth at the edge of the old Pierce Plantation Cemetery lay a series of wooden coffins, their lids facing east to west rather than north to south. The foreman, a veteran named Charles Avery, ordered the men to stop digging. One of the locals muttered a single name that rolled through the crew like a chill wind: Edward. Within hours, the story that had been buried for 2 decades rose again. The legend of Edward the Gravedigger, the 7-foot freedman who, according to rumor, buried 12 plantation owners in the very holes they'd ordered him to dig. By nightfall, half the county had heard the news. Old freedmen whispered prayers of thanks. Others shook their heads and warned not to speak the name aloud. To them, Edward wasn't a murderer or a myth. He was a reckoning, a figure conjured from the guilt of a South that refused to admit what it had done. To understand how one man's name could haunt generations, we have to go back nearly 30 years, to a world where men owned men, where the earth swallowed secrets faster than truth could expose them. Before we continue, subscribe to History in Chains and ring the bell, because stories like this, stories that balance on the line between truth and legend, deserve to be remembered. The first trace of Edward appears in a Natchez County deed dated April 2nd, 1844. The paper lists one Negro man, Edward, age 25, height 7'1", occupation, gravedigger. He was purchased by Randall Pierce, a wealthy planter known more for cruelty than competence. His estate stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile bottomland along the Mississippi, with over 100 enslaved people working under brutal conditions. Edward's task was simple: dig the graves, tend the burial ground, and keep the plantations dead in orderly silence. Those who lived under Pierce said Edward rarely spoke. He was tall beyond reason, his shoulders broad enough to cast shade across a mule's back. When he walked, the ground seemed to bend slightly beneath him. Children hid behind barrels when he passed, half in fear, half in awe. Despite his size, Edward was gentle in movement, careful not to frighten the living or disturb the dead. He carried a small leather pouch of river stones in his pocket, one for every grave he dug. No one knew why, though some swore they saw him drop a stone into each coffin before covering it with soil. By 1859, fever had swept through the Pierce plantation. Dozens died in a matter of weeks. Edward worked without rest, digging through the night, lowering bodies wrapped in coarse linen, while mosquitoes circled like vultures. It was during this time that strange marks began appearing on the headboards, 3 diagonal scratches carved deep into the wood. The overseer demanded an explanation, but Edward said nothing. Pierce ordered him whipped for insubordination. Witnesses claimed he didn't cry out once. When the war began, Pierce joined the Confederate cavalry, leaving the plantation to his wife and 2 overseers. They managed the property with incompetence and paranoia. Records show multiple runaway attempts, crop failures, and violence. In early 1863, the Pierce household ledger contains its final entry in the master's hand: Edward assigned to graveyard duty indefinitely, silent as the tombs he tends. After that, nothing, until the war ended and the Pierce name vanished from the rolls altogether. Freedmen's Bureau agents stationed in Jefferson County compiled post-war reports describing 12 missing planters between 1865 and 1867. Each disappearance was linked, at least by rumor, to the same area near Mason Creek. When asked about the vanished men, formerly enslaved witnesses offered only riddles. "The ground done took back what it was owed," one said. Another shrugged and muttered, "Edward's count is even now." In the summer of 1871, a northern journalist named Samuel Harper arrived in Mississippi to document Reconstruction unrest for the New York Tribune. Harper was a skeptic by training, but even he felt the pull of the Edward legend. His notebooks, preserved today in the Library of Congress, begin with the line, "Locals speak of a giant freedman who buries men alive. No proof, no graves, only whispers and fear." Harper traveled through the Delta, interviewing anyone who claimed to know Edward. Some described him as a ghost, others as a prophet. One old man insisted he had seen Edward leading a wagon load of empty coffins down the river road, whistling a tune no one recognized. Harper's search eventually led him to a woman named Ruth Carter, a former midwife from the Pierce plantation. She was 78 years old and living in a shack near Grand Gulf. "Edward was never cruel," she told Harper. "He just kept quiet, always listening. Mr. Pierce used to boast that even the Lord couldn't make him talk. Maybe the Lord took that as a challenge." When Harper asked about the disappearances, Ruth chuckled softly. "You can't bury what's already dead inside, son. Those men weren't killed by Edward. They were buried by their own sins long before he came along." Harper noted her words but pressed for details. Ruth leaned closer and said, "He dug 12 holes by the creek that last spring. Said it was for the fever that was coming. We all thought he meant sickness. Maybe he did." When the rain stopped, the holes were full and 12 bad men were gone. Folks say he walked into the river after that, still holding his shovel. Never came out. Back in Natchez, Harper spent weeks combing through courthouse records and church ledgers. At St. Luke's Parish, he found something remarkable. 12 burial entries from 1866 marked unknown white male. Each note included the same phrase, "Graves prepared in advance by E." In the margins, the minister had added, "No service given, remains delivered at dusk." Tucked inside the parish book was a folded letter on brittle paper, unsigned except for a single initial. The ink had bled from humidity, but the words were legible. "For every body I laid down without name, I shall lay down one that had too many. I dig for balance, not revenge." Harper made a copy and carried it north. When his article, "The Legend of Edward the Gravedigger," appeared in the Tribune in March of 1872, it caused an uproar. Southern editors called it Yankee slander, abolitionist fiction, another attempt to stain the honor of the defeated South. But among freed communities, the story spread like gospel. To them, Edward wasn't a killer. He was a symbol, an invisible judge who weighed the dead and the living with the same steady hand. Modern historians still debate whether Edward existed or if he was a composite of dozens of men erased by history. What we know is this: 12 planters disappeared. 12 unblessed graves were found, and in every account, a silent figure stood between guilt and redemption, shovel in hand, waiting for the earth to take its due. Natchez, Mississippi, spring of 1839. The first time Edward's name appeared in a ledger, he was 14, listed as boy, sound of body, unusually tall for age. He was sold with a dozen others downriver from Virginia to a trader who prided himself on delivering strong field stock to the new cotton frontier. The overseer who measured him against the wagon wheel laughed and said, "He'll make a fine ditch man if he ever stops growing." The joke stayed with him longer than the man who said it. By the time Edward reached adulthood, he had already lived under 3 owners: crossed 2 states, and learned that silence was safer than any promise. On Pierce Plantation, he was set first to work in the pits, where new ditches were dug for drainage. He moved like a machine, 1 scoop, 1 throw, rhythm steady as breathing. At night, he used the same shovel to dig shallow resting holes for the sick who died in the cabins. The first overseer called it good reuse of labor, and before long, Pierce assigned him permanently to the burying ground. The other workers said the master liked how quietly Edward worked, how he never asked for help, never spoke above a whisper, and always kept the graves straight. The quiet wasn't shyness, it was defense. A man who said less was whipped less. The legend of his silence began after a whipping that wasn't his. A woman named Dinah, older than Edward, and known for singing hymns in the fields, was accused of hiding food. When the overseer struck her, Edward stepped forward, not to fight, only to shield her. The blow that landed on his shoulder left a scar shaped like a cross. He didn't scream, didn't move, only stared until the whip stopped midair. The overseer said later he'd never seen a man's eyes look so empty and alive at once. From that day, no one heard Edward speak again, except to answer, "Roll." The quarters began to call him the Silent. He started marking the graves with his own code. 3 diagonal scratches on the wooden board. He said to one friend it meant Father, Son, Holy Ghost. To another it meant 3 days in the earth. When asked years later, survivors gave different answers. Historians think the marks might have been simple counting, a way to remember how many lives he had lowered into the ground. Whatever the truth, the marks became his signature. When people found them on the edges of unclaimed burial mounds after the war, they swore Edward had passed through again, measuring debts in wood and dirt. There was another habit that fed the later rumors: the stones. Small, river-smoothed pebbles he kept in a pouch at his belt. After each burial he chose one, and dropped it into the coffin or the soil above it. Nobody knew why. Some said he was keeping tally. Others said it was his way of giving the dead a token for the other side. By the 1850s, the children of the quarters whispered that if you stole one of Edward's stones, you'd dream of the person whose grave it came from. That story survived long after slavery ended, so when 12 planters disappeared after the war, people imagined they'd taken the stones meant for them. When Pierce Plantation suffered the yellow fever outbreak in 1859, it was Edward who organized the burials. Witness accounts describe him building rows of identical mounds, each perfectly spaced, each facing sunrise. He carved the 3 scratches, laid a single stone, then moved to the next. The preacher who visited said it looked like a military cemetery. "That man," he wrote, "honors the bodies better than their masters honored their lives." Those words circulated among the enslaved until they became prophecy. One day the gravedigger would bury the masters too, and the lines would finally be even. By the time the war began, Edward was middle-aged and nearly 7.5 feet tall, his hair gone gray at the temples. The war came to Pierce County late, but when it did, it came hungry. Soldiers took the livestock, burned barns, left the fields in ruin. The enslaved people fled or hid. Edward stayed, tending the dead soldiers the same way he had tended everyone else. He buried blue and gray side by side, marking each grave the same. A Union lieutenant wrote in his journal, "There is a tall Negro here who digs without stop. When asked whom he buries, he says nothing, only points to heaven." That entry, found years later, became Exhibit A in proving Edward's existence. When freedom finally came, no one knew what to call it. The bureau agents wrote that Edward refused rations or wages, that he simply kept to the cemetery, repairing fences, digging when necessary, feeding stray dogs from his own plate. Some nights he walked the road with a lantern, stopping at places where unmarked graves might lie, and leaving small piles of stones. To people who still feared ghosts, he became one. To those who needed justice, he became its instrument. That winter, 12 planters from the old Confederacy line went missing. The official explanation, fever, river accident, flight from debt, never satisfied anyone. But the locals noticed that near every site where one vanished, a new mound appeared, 3 scratches carved into a cedar post. The gravedigger had not spoken in decades, but now the earth spoke for him. The truth of what happened would never be written, only retold. And every retelling made Edward larger, until the man disappeared, and the legend remained. By the end of 1868, the freedmen who had worked beside Edward were scattered from Vicksburg to Natchez, but the stories they told of him began to braid together. In one version, he walked north with Union troops, digging graves for cholera victims along the rail line. In another, he vanished into the swamp and became a kind of guardian spirit who buried the old world. People disagreed on the facts, yet all agreed on one thing. Wherever cruelty had ruled, fresh mounds of earth appeared and peace followed. When Reconstruction officials arrived to rebuild the records of the ruined counties, they collected testimonies as proof of lawlessness. But those papers, instead of solving mysteries, multiplied them. The same names, Pierce, Latimer, Cray, appeared on lists of both missing debtors and unidentified remains. Clerks noted 3 scratches carved into headboards, sometimes chalked onto the walls of half-burned barns. No one signed the reports, but locals added in the margins, "E's mark." It was enough to revive old fear. In January of 1871, Samuel Harper returned from the north to finish what he called the Edward File. The Tribune wanted follow-up pieces on Reconstruction's ghosts, and the gravedigger's legend promised readers exactly the mix of horror and conscience the era demanded. Harper traveled with a freedman guide named Lewis Brown, who had once worked as a stable boy on Pierce Plantation. Brown told him, "If you want the truth, you have to talk to the ground. Everyone else been lying so long they can't tell the difference." They visited the old burial ridge at Mason Creek. The cedars had grown into a tangled wall, and the ground was soft where floodwater had risen years before. Harper found bits of cedar posts still showing the faint lines of diagonal carving. He measured them, sketched them, and later compared his drawings to the ledger scraps he'd copied from the courthouse. The angles matched within a hair. In his notes he wrote, "The marks may not signify vengeance, but record-keeping, an accountant's honesty rendered in wood and soil." That night, Harper lodged with a preacher named Reverend Caleb Dunn, who kept a small archive of parish documents rescued from war fires. Among them lay a sermon dated August 16, 1867. Its text came from Ecclesiastes, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns unto God who gave it." At the bottom of the page, Dunn had scribbled, "Preached at service for 12 unknown men. Graves dug beforehand by a Negro called Edward. Congregation uneasy." Harper copied the line into his notebook, underlining the word beforehand 3 times. The next morning he asked Dunn what he remembered. The old man smiled thinly. "Those planters weren't murdered," he said. "They were judged, some by fever, some by their own hand. Edward just gave them a place to lie down. That's what everyone missed." Harper pressed him for details, but the preacher would only add, "He understood that burying isn't killing. It's closing a story. When Harper's second article appeared that spring, titled "The Delta's Silent Judge," the reaction was mixed. Northern readers saw it as allegory, Southerners as insult, freed people as quiet vindication. In letters to the editor, former Confederates accused Harper of inventing superstition to demean them. One correspondent from Baton Rouge claimed to have met Edward in 1869 working as a ferryman and described him as harmless and dumb as an ox. Another insisted the man was a ghost seen walking across flooded fields. The contradiction only deepened the myth. For the next decade, travelers through the Delta reported seeing piles of smooth stones stacked beside crossroads and riverbanks. Children were told not to touch them. Field hands left single pebbles on fence posts before harvest as a sign of respect. People said those stones were Edward's, tokens of balance. No one could prove it, yet even skeptics avoided stepping on them. In the 1890s, a local teacher named Clara Mott began collecting these stories for the State Historical Society. She interviewed elderly freed people who remembered the man himself. Their recollections differed in detail, but shared a single mood: quiet gratitude. "He didn't scare us," one woman told her. "He scared the people who thought they owned us." Mott's manuscript, never published in her lifetime, survives only in fragments. But one line captures the legend's evolution. "The white men built monuments to generals. We built silence around Edward." By the turn of the century, Edward's name had left the newspapers and entered folklore collections. Folklorists catalogued him alongside John Henry and Brer Rabbit, symbols of labor turned into endurance, of strength without boast. Yet older families along Mason Creek still swore the graves were real. In 1927, when the Mississippi flooded, levee workers uncovered cedar boards etched with faint diagonal lines exactly where the Pierce Plantation Cemetery had been. The Port Gibson Herald ran a short piece titled "Marks of the Gravedigger Found." The editor dismissed it as coincidence, but the story reignited debate among historians. Half a century later, graduate students from Tulane University revisited the site with ground-penetrating equipment. They confirmed that beneath the silt lay a dozen rectangular disturbances, roughly the size of graves, all aligned east to west, all predating the Civil War by at least a decade. No remains were exhumed. The area was left undisturbed at the request of local residents. One researcher, interviewed in 1983, said, "Whether Edward existed or not, people needed him to. He gave shape to the reckoning they couldn't voice. If this story resonates, share it. Subscribe to History in Chains to keep the record of voices history tried to bury." What the legend of Edward the Gravedigger reminds us is that sometimes the truth isn't in the shovel or the soil, but in the silence left behind. By 1981, Mason Creek was a line of flooded fields and half-buried fence posts. The town that once supervised Edward's hands had become a cluster of houses, a gas station, and the brick ruin of St. Luke's Church leaning against its own graveyard. That summer, a historian named Dr. Anna Hollis drove down from Jackson with a grant from the State University, and a question that had followed her since graduate school: who was Edward? She had grown up hearing the tale from her grandmother, who called him the man who buried sin. Hollis didn't believe in ghosts, but she did believe in records. At the county archives, she found the same brittle folders Samuel Harper had handled a century earlier. The clerk shook his head when she asked about the missing pages. "You won't find the truth in paper, ma'am. It's out there in the mud." Hollis smiled politely and kept searching. In a storage box mislabeled "Property Disputes," she found a tattered envelope addressed to Mr. Pierce's successor. Inside lay a single page. For the work of laying down the lost, my thanks to the tall man Edward. Rev. C. Dunn, St. Luke's Parish, 1866. It was the first independent document to mention him by name, without malice or rumor. Hollis made the long drive to Mason Creek, following roads that bent with the river's old scars. At a crossroads, she met a farmer named Henry Brown, whose great-grandfather Lewis had guided Harper in 1871. Brown remembered the stories. Mama said Edward never killed nobody. He just kept burying till the ground quit hurtin'. Hollis asked if any of the old graves remained. Brown pointed toward the cypress brake. You'll find the place by the stones. We don't touch 'em. She found them at dusk, small mounds of rounded pebbles, each topped with 3 diagonal sticks pressed into the soil. Time had stolen everything but the gesture. Hollis photographed each pile, measured the spacing, and recorded coordinates. Back in Jackson, she entered the data into a computer, one of the first mapping programs the university had acquired, and discovered that the pattern formed a perfect line pointing toward the original site of Pierce Plantation. 12 points, almost equidistant. She wrote in her notes, "The legend may record a geography of mourning rather than murder." News of her findings reached the local paper. Within a week, reporters descended on Jefferson County, repeating the same headline Harper had used a century earlier. The Gravedigger returns. Residents were divided. Older families wanted the story forgotten. Younger ones saw it as heritage. The county board called for an inquiry, claiming Hollis's work disturbed sacred ground. She refused to stop. "History is already disturbed," she told them. "I'm just measuring the tremors." Among the letters Hollis received that year was one from a man named Reverend Paul Mason, pastor of a small Baptist church near Port Gibson. He claimed to be descended from Ruth Carter, the midwife who had spoken to Harper. Enclosed was a copy of a faded page from Ruth's Bible. In the margin she had written, "Edward went quiet because words could not lift the weight. When the war ended, he buried not men, but the deeds that made them." Hollis quoted it at every lecture afterward, saying it explained the legend better than any data ever could. In 1983, a film crew from PBS accompanied Hollis and her students back to Mason Creek to document the search. The footage, now archived in the State Museum, shows them wading through knee-deep water, uncovering cedar fragments, photographing each find with care. The narrator's voice asks, "Was Edward real?" Hollis answers, "Real enough to survive in memory when truth had nowhere else to live." The broadcast aired once, late at night, and generated letters from across the South. Teachers, preachers, former sharecroppers, all insisting that their own counties had known an Edward of some kind. By the late 80s, Hollis's research had grown into a movement. Community groups began placing small stone markers along the levee road to honor unrecorded graves. None bore Edward's full name, only the initial E scratched 3 times. The gesture spread quietly through the delta. Travelers left coins or pebbles on the markers. School children learned to trace the scratches as part of local history lessons. What began as one woman's research became a ritual of remembrance for a region still haunted by what it refused to face. Hollis's final paper, Edward the Gravedigger and the Ethics of Southern Memory, argued that the story endures not because of vengeance, but because of silence. "Every culture buries its sins," she wrote. "Edward reminds us that someone must dig the holes, and that silence, too, is labor." When she died in 1992, her students carried 12 stones from Mason Creek to her grave in Jackson and placed them in a straight line at the foot of her marker. Locals said the ground there never flooded again. Today, visitors to Jefferson County find only a weathered sign by the road. Mason Creek Site. Archaeological area do not disturb. Beyond it lies a field of whispering reeds and the hum of insects. Sometimes at sunset, people claim to see the outline of a tall figure near the trees, shovel resting against one shoulder, watching the river. Historians call it coincidence. Storytellers call it faith. Either way, the legend of Edward the Gravedigger endures because the South still needs him. By the early 2000s, Edward's name had passed from oral legend into public record. Students in Mississippi history courses now read excerpts from Harper's notebook beside Dr. Hollis's field maps. The story had become less a question of fact than of meaning. Did he really bury 12 men? No longer mattered as much as why people needed to believe he did. In 2001, the state erected a bronze marker near the Levee Road. It read simply, Edward the Gravedigger, 1820-1867, a man of silence and balance. Beneath the line lay 12 small circles, each carved with diagonal slashes. The unveiling drew a crowd of 300, descendants of enslaved families, professors, church choirs, even distant relatives of the Pierce lineage, who came, as one man admitted, to see the ghost buried for good. When the pastor of St. Luke's read the dedication, thunder rolled from the west. Some called it coincidence, others an amen. That evening, local news interviewed attendees. An elderly woman wearing a white lace bonnet that once belonged to her grandmother said, "We don't know if he lived or died right here, but every grave dug honest makes him live again." Her words became the closing line of the segment. The next day, letters arrived from viewers across the country, thanking the town for finally naming the nameless. In the years that followed, scholars treated Edward's story as a lens on memory itself. At the University of Mississippi, seminars titled Silence as Testimony drew packed classrooms. Papers compared Edward's ritual of burial to West African ancestral customs, to Christian liturgy, to post-war trauma practices. A new generation of writers framed him not as avenger, but as archivist, someone who wrote history with a shovel because no pen was available. In 2012, archaeologists revisited the Mason Creek site using newer imaging tools. They detected outlines of wooden coffins and the faint traces of stone mounds leading toward the river. Out of respect, nothing was excavated. Instead, the State Museum curated a digital reconstruction, allowing visitors to walk virtually among the graves. In the exhibition's audio track, a low voice recites Harper's note, "He buries without speaking, and the earth answers in kind." The narrator's tone is calm, reverent, nearly prayerful. Visitors leave whispering, as if still inside a church. By the time the 20th century ended, Edward's myth had done something few Southern stories ever achieved. It united people who usually stood on opposite sides of remembrance. Descendants of planters began attending the same commemorations as descendants of the enslaved. Both sides found themselves humbled before a man who never raised his voice. A teacher from Vicksburg said during one memorial, "Maybe Edward's silence is what we all owe each other. A pause long enough to hear what's still buried." Modern writers keep returning to him. In essays, he appears as a metaphor for restorative justice. In poems, as a figure who walks the delta at night, counting unmarked graves. In plays, as a tall silhouette who refuses to speak until the audience grows quiet. Each retelling adds another layer of interpretation, yet all preserve the essential core. A man, a shovel, a promise that the ground will remember what people try to forget. When Dr. Hollis's archives were digitized in 2019, technicians found an unlabeled cassette among her field recordings. The audio crackled with cicadas and running water. Then came her voice, tired but steady. If he was real, he taught us that silence can be moral work. If he wasn't, then we made him real to teach ourselves the same. The tape ends with the sound of stones falling one by one into shallow water. Today, the site lies quiet. The highway hums a mile away, and beyond it the river bends in slow circles, swallowing light. Travelers sometimes stop by the bronze marker and leave 3 pebbles in a line, imitating the old sign. There are no tour guides, no ticket booths, only wind through reeds and the smell of mud after rain. On certain evenings the sun hits the marker just right, and its shadow stretches tall across the grass, long enough to resemble a man walking toward the trees. People who see it don't speak. They stand still for a moment and then move on. The legend of Edward the Gravedigger remains not because of what he may have done, but because of what he represents. The labor of acknowledging pain without repeating it. The act of setting history down carefully, one grave at a time. Every nation that buries its dead must decide how much truth to lower into the ground with them. Edward's story suggests that somewhere between denial and vengeance lies the hard work of silence, the work of digging until the count is even. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe to History in Chains, where we uncover the forgotten accounts that still shape the living. Because every mark left on this soil, whether carved in wood or memory, reminds us that the earth keeps its own records, and the past, like Edward himself, never really stays buried.